Hello guys and welcome back to the stream of the week. We have all this week been doing something from Mermaid or Mermaid List. What I have been doing, guys, as you probably can see now, that there we've completed the paper version. We're now use these 3 prompts, and we made that picture over on the paper version. We're now going to be digitizing that one, guys, and I'm going to show you each stage, how to do each stage, because before I colored that in yesterday, I did take a picture of it on my tablet, which I normally do, and then I took this app which is called Critter. I'm going to go and sit down in my chair because what I've got to do is I'm in a different position. I'm not on my table. The camera's in a different position. So I'm going to move over there. I did record this in previous things. If you guys are watching live and you want me to record these in a more of a fashion before, check out the old ones. You'll see certain problems I've got at the moment. This is why I do the construction lines live. But if you want to see this in less of where when I'm doing it live, guys, all I can do is this way by actually watching your screen. So you'll be able to see everything you should be able to see when I do the construction lines. I'll show you each stage and everything that in a moment, so keep tuned for that one. My name's Blut084, BLUT084, Art and Games. I'm here every single day on YouTube, occasionally on Mixer, but every day and night over on Instagram. And if you have been watching all this week, don't forget, if you were here and want to listen to the rest of the story that we listened to yesterday from H.G. Wells, the Sea Lady, absolutely amazing story. But it's H.G. Wells, so it's gonna be. And it's tying in with the time travel thing that I've got going on over on the thing when I'm doing the art. If you want me to create a scene in the water, because we're in Mermaid, in the VR, let me know. Either way, otherwise, later on this week, I will be doing some more Iron Man. I'm creating my VR Iron Man workshop, so we can have a Iron Man in different areas. Definitely go and check that video out for more information on that one. We're going to get on with this. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to get this going. Sit down on my chair. Right. So we are now in the app called Critter, guys. Hopefully you can still hear me. If you can't, let me know if you're watching live. Yeah, so we're going to digitize this one now. We've done the paper version, which you can see here. I'll give you a quick zoom in of everything we did. And that's how the paper version is looking at the moment. We are going to digitize this now. So we'll take away all those horrible pencil lines. We'll give it an actual decent coloring. As I did use some ink on this as well, as you can see with the shading up on the top here. We can use this app here to add a lot more shading on here. But that is the paper version. We are now doing the digital version. My mouse has decided to freak out. Why are you freaking out, mouse? Let's see, the battery's gone. Battery's gone in me mouse. I've got a cordless mouse, guys, and batteries. Here we go. The battery's running out. Right, put that back down. But like I was saying, guys, we're going to digitize. That's the paper version you're looking at now, and we are live. So I do apologise for any. Not working. So let's get our playlist in the background while I'm faffing around.
Well, they won't put mine in, said her sister. It's horrid. I shall go right off now and have it taken again. They'll interview the dead. No, said Mr. Bunting, terrified. Your mother. It's your place, my dear, said Bunting. But
Okay,
the dead.
right. Now the mouse back on working.
I couldn't.
That's the playlist you're going to be listening to, guys. If it needs turning up again, let me know in the comment section. I'm going to try and check things in a minute on my phone. If you want to say hi, just say hi in the comments. That's the stage and where you will be. That is where you are. This is where you can leave the comments. Don't forget to check down below and say hi. Right, we've got all of this here. This is, again, just the paper version we did. We're going to do all of these characters, and now we're going to go into the construction lines. So let's get the paper version, which I took a picture of before I coloured it in. We'll go to the image up in the top here. Lots of editing tools here. We're going to flip it 90 degrees, like that. And there we go. We've got the same image, but with the shading where I wanted it. That's the original picture before I coloured it in, guys. Might make it ever so slightly bigger because of those lines here on the side. I can get rid of those because I won't keep those construction lines. It may de-shape the picture a little bit. So yeah, I'll show you what I do. We got here the opacity bar, which you can see where the cursor is. You turn that one down, and that makes that one completely faded. And then we go to the little plus bar here. Again, this guy's is Krita, Krita, completely free. If you want a link, let me know in the comment section. We then make another layer, and that will be the layer that will start making the pen lines on, or the construction lines as it's called. I'm deciding whether I should separate this into more than one load of construction lines. I could just go over the whole thing. Right, okay, so let's pick our pen. We've got loads of tools down here again, if you can see them. This one there are all razors and stuff like that. That is the main tool when I'm like doing the base color down, the basic one. So we'll scroll down here and we'll go to the pen. It's a fine line pen. The same kind of situation as if I was going over the sketch. I'm going to make that just slightly more darker so I can actually see it. Construction line on it. Let's go quickly down to our Ariel from our Disney part of the list. And the list again is Octopus, Ice, Dawn, Disney, Future, Dark, and Treasure. I did give you explanation on why those words have been chosen. Again, it's Mermaid, so if you know anything about that, you'll know what I'm chatting about. We're going to be construction lines, just having it in the darkest of the dark, which is black. Get shading here if we do. I don't think that black was black enough. So for an ink, and we can just go over. Whoops. Always make sure you're on the right layer. That's layer 2. I think layer 2, I'm going to call that construction lines. Column lines. There she goes. Column lines. There we go. Yes. All right. So we've got column lines, and then we'll add. We can always add another layer now if we want to. We can add that to just call that one color, but we won't color today. We'll do that in the next video, guys, and I probably will record that one and have the playlist playing in the background because it's a 4-hour book, so it gives me something to listen to while I'm actually doing something, so I don't have to keep faffing around like in the other videos. If you saw last week's attempt, I'm only on one screen, and that's why I'm recording like this. And if I ever flick back to do that, you can't see what I'm doing. So I do that. But like I was saying, guys, you go down. That's the color layer. And you want that actually to be on top. The construction lines want to be the top layer. On top of the color layer. So we'll move that one. And I think we'll go with this size. But you can change the size of the pen. So if you want that there, that's fine. Or make it ever so slightly bigger and put that there. But I'm keeping with the default. Oh, I think that line's a bit thick. I do. That's a bit too thick for my liking, so I'm going to turn it down ever so slightly. Down like that. That's more like it. Close to that line, in fact. That's exactly that line. Okay. Let's turn that up to what that line's like. Yeah, we'll call that one. I like that. So let's get the playlist going. You'll see what I'm doing, guys. Oh, this will probably take me about an hour's time, so enjoy the playlist in the background. Or if you have any live comments, guys, my phone will be available, and you can leave some comments there. If you can't watch and you can't leave a comment because you're watching and you haven't signed in, don't worry about it, guys. I'm also over on Instagram. You can leave me a comment over there. PM me or go to the post and leave a comment. My name again is Blut084, BLUT084. Art and games. This was the list from paper, and that was Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday for colour. Now we're Thursday and Friday for digitisation.
Said Mr. Bunting. Well, someone will have
If you'd
to
like to
tell
listen
me
to the
anyhow,
rest of this,
said
then
Mrs.
go and
Bunting.
check out
You know
yesterday's
they
colouring
will.
video for the
I
beginning
listened to
of
talk,
this
but I
playlist.
wanted, wailed the sea lady with the daily gunfire in her hand. Can't it be stopped? You don't know our journalists, said Fred. The tact of my cousin Melville saved the situation. He had dabbled in journalism and talked with literary fellows like myself. And literary fellows like myself are apt at times to be very free and outspoken about the press. He heard of the Bunting shrinking terror of publicity as soon as he arrived, a perfect clamor, an almost exultant clamor indeed of shrinking terror, and he caught the sea lady's eye and took his line there and then. It's not an occasion for sticking at trifles, Mrs. Bunting, he said, but I think we can save the situation all the same. You're too hopeless. We must put our foot down at once, that's all. Let me see these reporter fellows and write to the London dailies. I think I can take a line that will settle them. Eh? Said Fred. I can take a line that will stop it, trust me. What, altogether? Altogether. How? Said Fred and Mrs. Bunting. You're not going to bribe them? Bribe? Said Mr. Bunting. We're not in France. You can't bribe a British paper. A sort of subdued cheer went around from the assembled Buntings. You leave it to me, said Melville, in his element. And with earnestly expressed, but not very confident wishes for his success, they did. He managed the thing admirably. What's this about a mermaid? He demanded of the local journalists when they returned. They traveled together for company, being, so to speak, emergency journalists, compositors in their milder moments and unaccustomed to these higher aspects of journalism. What's this about a mermaid? Repeated my cousin, while they waved precedence dumbly one to another. I believe someone's been letting you in, said my cousin Melville. Just imagine, a mermaid. Well, that's what we thought, said the younger of the two emergency journalists. We knew it was some sort of hoax, you know. Only the new paper gave it a headline. I'm amazed, even Banghurst, said my cousin Melville. It's in the Daily Gunfire as well, said the older of the two emergency journalists. What's one more or less of these halfpenny fever rags? Cried my cousin with a ringing scorn. Surely you're not going to take your Folkestone news from mere London papers. But how did the story come about? Began the older emergency journalist. That's not my affair. The younger emergency journalist had an inspiration. He produced a notebook from his breast pocket. Perhaps, sir, you wouldn't mind suggesting to us something we might say. My cousin Melville complied. 2. The rising young journalist who had first got wind of the business, who must not for a moment be confused with the two emergency journalists heretofore described, came to Banghurst next night in a state of strange exultation. I've been through with it, and I've seen her, he panted. I waited about outside and saw her taken into the carriage. I've talked to one of the maids. I got into the house under pretense of being a telephone man to see their telephone. I spotted the wire, and it's a fact, a positive fact. She's a mermaid with a tail, a proper mermaid's tail. I've got here. He displayed sheets. What you talking about? Said Banghurst from his littered desk, eyeing the sheets with apprehensive animosity. The mermaid. There really is a mermaid at Folkestone. Banghurst turned away from him and pawed at his pen tray. What if there is, he said after a pause. But it's proved. That note you printed, that note I printed was a mistake if there's any of that sort going, young man. Banghurst remained an obstinate expansion of back. How? We don't deal in mermaids here. But you're not going to let it drop. I am. But there she is. Let her be. He turned on the rising young journalist, and his massive face was unusually massive, and his voice fine and full and fruity. Do you think we're going to make our public believe anything simply because it's true? They know perfectly well what they are going to believe and what they aren't going to believe, and they aren't going to believe anything about mermaids. You bet your hat. I don't care if the whole damned beach was littered with mermaids, not the whole damned beach. We've got our reputation to keep up. See? Look here. You don't learn journalism as I'd hoped you do. It was you that brought in all that stuff about a discovery in chemistry. It's true. I had it from a fellow of the Royal Society. I don't care if you had it from anybody. Stuff that the public won't believe aren't facts. Being true only makes them worse. They buy our paper and swallow it, and it's got to go down easy. When I printed you that note and headline, I thought you was up to a lark. I thought you was onto a mixed bathing scandal or something of that sort, with juice in it. The sort of thing they all understand. You know, when you went down to Folkestone, you were going to describe what Salisbury and all the rest of them wear upon the leaves, and start a discussion on the acclimatization of the cafe and all that. And then you get on with this unprintable epithet nonsense. But Lord Salisbury, he doesn't go to Folkestone. Banghurst shrugged his shoulders over a hopeless case. What the deuce, he said, addressing his inkpot in plaintive tones, does that matter? The young man reflected. He addressed Banghurst's back after a pause. His voice had flattened a little. I might go over this and do it up as a lark, perhaps. Make it a comic dialogue sketch with a man who really believed in it, or something like that. It's a beastly lot of copy to get slumped, you know. No how, said Banghurst. Not in any shape, no. Why, they'd think it clever. They'd think you was making game of them. They hate things they think are clever. The young man made as if to reply, but Banghurst's back expressed quite clearly that the interview was at an end. No how, repeated Banghurst, just when it seemed he had finished altogether. I may take it to the gunfire, then? Banghurst suggested an alternative. Very well, said the young man, heated. The gunfire it is. But in that he was reckoning without the editor of the gunfire. 3. It must have been quite soon after that I myself heard the first mention of the mermaid, little recking that at last it would fall to me to write her history. I was on one of my rare visits to London, and Micklethwaite was giving me lunch at the Penwiper Club, certainly one of the best dozen literary clubs in London. I noted the rising journalist at a table near the door, lunching alone. All about him, tables were vacant, though the other parts of the room were crowded. He sat with his face towards the door, and he kept looking up whenever anyone came in, as if he expected someone who never came. Once, distinctly, I saw him beckon to a man, but the man did not respond. Look here, Micklethwaite, I said. Why is everybody avoiding that man over there? I noticed just now in the smoking room that he seemed to be trying to get into conversation with someone, and that a kind of taboo. Micklethwaite stared over his fork. Rather, he said. But what's he done? He's a fool, said Micklethwaite, with his mouth full, evidently annoyed. Ugh, he said, as soon as he was free to do so. I waited a little while. What's he done? I ventured. Micklethwaite did not answer for a moment, and crammed things into his mouth vindictively, bread and all sorts of things. Then, leaning towards me in a confidential manner, he made indignant noises which I could not clearly distinguish as words. Oh, I said, when he had done. Yes, said Micklethwaite. He swallowed, and then poured himself wine, splashing the tablecloth. He had me for an hour very nearly the other day. Yes, I said. Silly fool, said Micklethwaite. I was afraid it was all over, but luckily he gave me an opening again after gulping down his wine. He leads you on to argue, he said, that he can't prove it. Yes? And then he shows you he can, just showing off how damned ingenious he is. I was a little confused. Prove what? I asked. Haven't I been telling you, said Micklethwaite, growing very red, about this confounded mermaid of his at Folkestone? He says there is one? Yes, he does, said Micklethwaite, going purple and staring at me very hard. He seemed to ask mutely whether I, of all people, proposed to turn on him and back up this infamous scoundrel. I thought for a moment he would have apoplexy, but happily he remembered his duty as my host. So he turned very suddenly on a meditative waiter for not removing our plates. Had any golf lately? I said to Micklethwaite, when the plates and the remains of the waiter had gone away. Golf always does Micklethwaite good, except when he is actually playing. Then, I am told, if I were Mrs. Bunting, I should break off and raise my eyebrows and both hands at this point to indicate how golf acts on Micklethwaite when he is playing. I turned my mind to feigning an interest in golf, a game that, in truth, I despise and hate, as I despise and hate nothing else in this world. Imagine a fat creature like Micklethwaite, a creature who ought to wear a turban and a long black robe to hide his grossness, whacking a little white ball for miles and miles with a perfect surgery of instruments, whacking it either with a babyish solemnity or a childish rage, as luck may have decided, whacking away while his country goes to the devil, and incidentally training an innocent-eyed little boy to swear and be a tip-hunting loafer. That's golf. However, I controlled my all too facile sneer and talked of golf and the relative merits of golf links as I might talk to a child about buns or distract a puppy with the whisper of rats. And when at last I could look at the rising young journalist again, our lunch had come to an end. I saw that he was talking with a greater air of freedom than it is usual to display to club waiters to the man who held his coat. The man looked incredulous but respectful, and was answering shortly but politely. When we went out, this little conversation was still going on. The waiter was holding the rising young journalist's soft felt hat, and the rising young journalist was fumbling in his coat pocket with a thick mass of papers. It's tremendous. I've got most of it here, he was saying as we went by. I don't know if you'd care. I get very little time for reading, sir, the waiter was replying. End of chapter 4. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 4 of The Sea Lady by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Sea Lady by H.G. Wells, chapter the 4th. The Quality of Parker. 1. So far I have been very full, I know, and verisimilitude has been my watchword rather than the true affidavit style. But if I have made it clear to the reader just how the Sea Lady landed, and just how it was possible for her to land and become a member of human society without any considerable excitement on the part of that society, such poor pains as I have taken to tint and shadow and embellish the facts at my disposal will not have been taken in vain. She positively and quietly settled down with the Buntings. Within a fortnight, she had really settled down so thoroughly that, save for her exceptional beauty and charm and the occasional faint touches of something a little indefinable in her smile, she had become a quite passable and credible human being. She was a cripple indeed, and her lower limb was most pathetically swathed and put in a sort of case, but it was quite generally understood, I'm afraid at Mrs. Bunting's initiative, that presently they, Mrs. Bunting said they, which was certainly almost as far, or even a little farther than legitimate prevarication may go, would be as well as ever. Of course, said Mrs. Bunting, she will never be able to bicycle again. That was the sort of glamour she threw about it. 2. In Parker, it is indisputable that the Sea Lady found, or at least had found for her by Mrs. Bunting, a treasure of the richest sort. Parker was still fallaciously young, but she had been maid to a lady from India who had been in a case and had experienced and overcome cross-examination. She had also been deceived by a young man whom she had fancied greatly, only to find him walking out with another, contrary to her inflexible sense of correctness, in the presence of which all other things are altogether vain. Life, she had resolved, should have no further surprises for her. She looked out on its largely improper pageant with an expression of alert impartiality in her hazel eyes, calm, doing her specific duty, and entirely declining to participate further. She always kept her elbows down by her side and her hands always just in contact, and it was impossible for the most powerful imagination to conceive her under any circumstances as being anything but absolutely straight and clean and neat. And her voice was always, under all circumstances, low and wonderfully distinct, just to an infinitesimal degree indeed, mincing. Mrs. Bunting had been a little nervous when it came to the point. It was Mrs. Bunting, of course, who engaged her, because the sea lady was so entirely without experience. But certainly Mrs. Bunting's nervousness was thrown away. "You understand," said Mrs. Bunting, taking a plunge at it, that she is an invalid. "I didn't, ma'am," replied Parker respectfully, and evidently quite willing to understand anything as part of her duty in this world. "In fact," said Mrs. Bunting, rubbing the edge of the tablecloth daintily with her gloved finger and watching the operation with interest, "as a matter of fact, she has a mermaid's tail." "Mermaid's tail? Indeed, ma'am. And is it painful at all?" "Oh dear, no, it involves no inconvenience. Nothing. Except, you understand, there is a need of discretion." "Of course, ma'am," said Parker, as who should say, "there always is. We particularly don't want the servants." "The lower servants? No, ma'am." "You understand?" And Mrs. Bunting looked up again and regarded Parker calmly. "Precisely, ma'am," said Parker, with a face unmoved, and so they came to the question of terms. "It all passed off most satisfactorily," said Mrs. Bunting, taking a deep breath at the mere memory of that moment, and it is clear that Parker was quite of her opinion. She was not only discreet, but really clever and handy. From the very outset, she grasped the situation, unostentatiously but very firmly. It was Parker who contrived the sort of violin case for it, and who made the tea-gown extension that covered the case's arid contours. It was Parker who suggested an invalid's chair for use indoors and in the garden, and a carrying chair for the staircase. Hitherto, Fred Bunting had been on hand, at last, even in excessive abundance, whenever the sea lady lay in need of masculine arms. But Parker made it clear at once that that was not at all in accordance with her ideas, and so earned the lifelong gratitude of Mabel Glendower. And Parker, too, spoke out for drives and suggested, with an air of rightness that left nothing else to be done, the hire of a carriage and pair for the season, to the equal delight of the Bunting and the sea lady. It was Parker who dictated the daily drive up to the eastern end of the Leas, and the sea lady's transfer, and the manner of the sea lady's transfer, to the bath chair in which she promenaded the Leas. There seemed to be nowhere that it was pleasant and proper for the sea lady to go that Parker did not swiftly and correctly indicate it and the way to get to it, and there seems to have been nothing that it was really undesirable the sea lady should do, and anywhere that it was really undesirable that she should go, that Parker did not at once invisibly but effectively interpose a bar. It was Parker who released the sea lady from being a sort of private and peculiar property in the Bunting household, and carried her off to a becoming position in the world when the crisis came. In little things as in great, she failed not. It was she who made it luminous that the sea lady's card plate was not yet engraved and printed. Miss Doris Thalassia Waters was the pleasant and appropriate name with which the sea lady came primed, and who replaced the box of the presumably dank and drowned and dripping Tom by a jewel case, a dressing bag, and the first of the sea lady's trunks. On 1,000 little occasions, this Parker showed a sense of propriety that was penetratingly fine. For example, in the shop one day when things of an intimate sort were being purchased, she suddenly intervened. "There are stockings, ma'am," she said, in a discreet undertone, behind, but not too vulgarly behind, a fluttering straight hand. "Stockings!" cried Mrs. Bunting. "But I think, ma'am, she should have stockings," said Parker, quietly but very firmly. And come to think of it, why should an unavoidable deficiency in a lady excuse one that can be avoided? It's there we touch the very quintessence and principle of the proper life. But Mrs. Bunting, would never have seen it like that. 3. Let me add here, regretfully but with infinite respect, one other thing about Parker, and then she shall drop into her proper place. I must confess with a slight tinge of humiliation that I pursued this young woman to her present situation at Highton Towers, maid she is to that eminent religious and social propagandist, the Lady Jane Glanville. There were certain details of which I stood in need, certain scenes and conversations of which my passion for verisimilitude had scarcely a crumb to go upon. And from first to last, what she must have seen and learnt and inferred would amount practically to everything. I put this to her frankly. She made no pretense of not understanding me, nor of ignorance in certain hidden things. When I had finished, she regarded me with a level regard. "I couldn't think of it, sir," she said. "It wouldn't be at all according to my ideas. But it surely couldn't possibly hurt you now to tell me." "I'm afraid I couldn't, sir." "It couldn't hurt anyone." "It isn't that, sir. I should see you didn't lose by it, She looked at me politely, having said what she intended to say. And in spite of what became at last very fine and handsome inducements, that remained the inflexible Parker's reply. Even after I had come to an end with my finesse, and attempted to bribe her in the grossest manner, she displayed nothing but a becoming respect for my impregnable social superiority. "I couldn't think of it, sir," she repeated. "It wouldn't be at all according to my ideas." And if in the end you should find the story to any extent vague or incomplete, I trust you will remember how the inflexible severity of Parker's ideas stood in my way. End of chapter 4. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Sea Lady, Chapter 5. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Sea Lady by H.G. Wells. Chapter the 5th. The absence and return of Mr. Harry Chappell.
Sorry, this is taking me a long time, but
these digressions
really getting
about Parker and the journalists have certainly
Yeah.
led me astray from the story a little. You will, however, understand that while the rising young journalist was still in pursuit of information, Hope in Banghurst, and Parker merely a budding perfection, the carriage not even thought of, things were already developing in that bright little establishment beneath the evergreen oaks on the Folkestone Riviera. So soon as the minds of the Buntings ceased to be altogether focused upon this new and amazing social addition they, of all people, had most indisputably discovered, it became at first faintly and then very clearly evident that their own simple pleasure in the possession of a guest so beautiful as Miss Waters, so solidly wealthy, and, in a manner, so distinguished, was not entirely shared by the two young ladies who were to have been their principal guests for the season. This little rift was perceptible the very first time Mrs. Bunting had an opportunity of talking over her new arrangements with Miss Glendower. "And is she really going to stay with you all the summer?" said Adeline. "Surely, dear, you don't mind? It takes me a little by surprise." "She's asked me, my dear. I'm thinking of Harry. If the general election comes on in September, and everyone seems to think it will, you promised you would let us inundate you with electioneering. But do you think she will be dreadfully in the way?" She added after an interval, "She stops my working." "But, my dear, she's out of harmony," said Adeline. Mrs. Bunting looked out of a window at the tamarisk and the sea. I'm sure I wouldn't do anything to hurt Harry's prospects. You know how enthusiastic we all are. Randolph would do anything. But are you sure she will be in the way? What else can she be? She might help even. Oh, help. She might canvass. She's very attractive, you know, dear. Not to me, said Miss Glendower. I don't trust her. But to some people. And, as Harry says, at election times, everyone who can do anything must be let do it. Cut them. Do anything afterwards. But at the time, you know he talked of it when Mr. Feisner and he were here. If you left electioneering only to the really nice people. It was Mr. Feisner said that, not Harry, and besides, she wouldn't help. I think you misjudge her there, dear. She has been asking to help. Yes, and all about it, said Mrs. Bunting with a transient pink. She keeps asking questions about why we are having the election, and what it is all about, and why Harry is a candidate and all that. She wants to go into it quite deeply. I can't answer half the things she asks. And that's why she keeps up those long conversations with Mr. Melville, I suppose, and why Fred goes about neglecting Mabel. My dear, said Mrs. Bunting, I wouldn't have her canvassing with us for anything, said Miss Glendower. She'd spoil everything. She is frivolous and satirical. She looks at you with incredulous eyes. She seems to blight all one's earnestness. I don't think you quite understand, dear Mrs. Bunting, what this election and my studies mean to me, and Harry. She comes across all that like a contradiction. Surely, my dear, I've never heard her contradict. Oh, she doesn't contradict, but there is something about her. One feels that things that are most important and vital are nothing to her. Don't you feel it? She comes from another world to us. Mrs. Bunting remained judicial. Adeline dropped to a lower key again. I think, she said, anyhow, that we're taking her very easily. How do we know what she is? Down there, out there, she may be anything. She may have had excellent reasons for coming to land. My dear, cried Mrs. Bunting, is that charity? How do they live? If she hadn't lived nicely, I'm sure she couldn't behave so nicely. Besides, coming here, she had no invitation. I've invited her now, said Mrs. Bunting gently. You could hardly help yourself. I only hope your kindness... It's not the kindness, said Mrs. Bunting. It's a duty. If she were only half as charming as she is, you seem to forget, her voice dropped, what it is she comes for. That's what I want to know. I'm sure in these days, with so much materialism about and such wickedness everywhere, when everybody who has a soul seems trying to lose it, to find anyone who hadn't a soul and who is trying to find one. But is she trying to get one? Mr. Flange comes twice every week. He would come oftener, as you know, if there wasn't so much confirmation about. And when he comes, he sits and touches her hand, if he can, and he talks in his lowest voice, and she sits and smiles. She almost laughs outright at the things he says. Because he has to win his way with her. Surely Mr. Flange may do what he can to make religion attractive. I don't believe she believes she will get a soul. I don't believe she wants one a bit. She turned towards the door as if she had done. Mrs. Bunting's pink was now permanent. She had brought up a son and 2 daughters, and besides, she had brought down a husband too. My dear, how was I to know? And when it was necessary to be firm, even with Adeline Glendower, she knew how to be firm just as well as anybody. My dear, she began, in her very firmest, quiet manner, I am positive you misjudge Miss Waters. Trivial she may be, on the surface at any rate. Perhaps she laughs and makes fun, a little. There are different ways of looking at things. But I am sure that at bottom she is just as serious, just as grave as anyone. You judge her hastily. I am sure if you knew her better, as I do. Mrs. Bunting left an eloquent pause. Miss Glendower had two little pink flushes in her cheeks. She turned with her hand on the door. "At any rate," she said, "I am sure that Harry will agree with me that she can be no help to our cause. We have our work to do, and it is something more than just vulgar electioneering. We have to develop and establish ideas. Harry has views that are new and wide-reaching. We want to put our whole strength into this work, now especially, and her presence—" She paused for a moment. "It is a digression. She divides things. She puts it all wrong. She has a way of concentrating attention about herself. She alters the values.
Just say that quickly, guys, because I got
She prevents my being single-minded. She will prevent Harry being
Just
single-minded.
say it.
I think, my dear, that you might trust my judgment a little," said Mrs. Bunting, and paused. Miss Glendower opened her mouth and shut it again, without speaking. It became evident finality was attained. Nothing remained to be said but the regrettable. The door opened and closed smartly, and Mrs. Bunting was alone. Within an hour they all met at the luncheon table, and Adeline's behavior to the sea lady and to Mrs. Bunting was as pleasant and alert as
Oh
any
my God, I just
highly
saved it as a JPEG.
intellectual young lady
Quick!
could be. And all that Mrs. Bunting said and did tended, with what people call infinite tact, which really, means a great deal more tact than is comfortable, to develop and expose the more serious aspect of the sea
I
lady's
will
life.
lose everything I've just
Mr.
done.
Bunting was
Well, not everything,
unusually
but there won't be a layer
talkative
between them.
and told them all about a glorious project he had just heard of to cut out the rather shrubby and weedy front of the Leas and stick in something between a wine vault and the Crystal Palace as a winter garden, which seemed to him a very excellent idea indeed. 2. It is time now to give some impression of the imminent Chatteris, who, for all his late appearance, is really the chief human being in my cousin Melville's story. It happens that I met him with some frequency in my university days, and afterwards ever and again I came upon him. He was rather a brilliant man at the university, smart without being vulgar, and clever for all that. He was remarkably good-looking from the very onset of his manhood, and without being in any way a showy spendthrift, was quite magnificently extravagant. There was trouble in his last year, something hushed up about a girl or woman in London, but his family had it all over with him, and his uncle, the Earl of Beechcroft, settled some of his bills. Not all, for the family is commendably free from sentimental excesses, but enough to make him comfortable again. The family is not a rich one, and it further abounds in an extraordinary quantity of rather frowsy, loose-tongued aunts. I never knew a family quite so rich in old aunts. But Chatteris was so good-looking, easy-mannered, and clever that they seemed to agree almost without discussion to pull him through. They hunted about for something that would be really remunerative without being laborious or too commercial. And meanwhile, after the extraordinary craving of his aunt, Lady Poynting Mallow, to see him acting, had been overcome by the united efforts of the more religious section of his aunts, Chatteris set himself seriously to the higher journalism, that is to say, the journalism that dines anywhere, gets political tips after dinner, and is always acceptable, if only to avoid 13 articles, in a half-crown review. In addition, he wrote some very passable verse and edited Jane Austen for the only publisher who had not already reprinted the works of that classic lady. His verse, like himself, was shapely and handsome, and, like his face, it suggested to the penetrating eye certain reservations and indecisions. There was just that touch of refinement that is weakness in the public man. But as yet he was not a public man. He was known to be energetic, and his work was gathering attention, as always capable and occasionally brilliant. His aunts declared he was ripening, that any defect in vigor he displayed was the incompleteness of the process, and decided he should go to America, where vigor and vigorous opportunities abound, and there, I gather, he came upon something like a failure. Something happened Indeed, quite a lot happened. He came back unmarried and via the South Seas, Australasia and India, and Lady Pointing Mallow publicly told him he was a fool when he got back. What happened in America, even if one does not consult contemporary American papers, is still very difficult to determine. There appear to have been the daughter of a millionaire and something like an engagement in the story. According to the New York Yell, one of the smartest, crispest, and altogether most representative papers in America, there was also the daughter of someone else whom the Yell interviewed, or professed to interview, under the heading, "An aristocratic Britisher trifles with a pure American girl interview with the victim of his heartless levity." But this someone else was, I am inclined to think, in spite of her excellently executed portrait, merely a brilliant stroke of modern journalism, the Yell having got wind of the sudden retreat of Chatteris and inventing a reason, in preference to discovering one. Wensleydale tells me the true impetus to bolt was the merest trifle. The daughter of the millionaire, being a bright and spirited girl, had undergone interviewing on the subject of her approaching marriage, on marriage in general, on social questions of various sorts, and on the relations of the British and American peoples, and he seems to have found the thing in his morning paper. It took him suddenly, and he lost his head. And once he started, he seems to have lacked the power of mind to turn about and come back. The affair was a mess. The family paid some more of his bills and shirked others, and Chatteris turned up in London again after a time with somewhat diminished glory and a series of letters on imperial affairs, each headed with the quotation, "What do they know of England, who only England know?" Of course, people of England learnt nothing of the real circumstances of the case, but it was fairly obvious that he had gone to America and come back empty-handed. And that was how, in the course of some years, he came to Adeline Glendower, of whose special gifts as his helper and inspiration you have already heard from Mrs. Bunting. When he became engaged to her, the family, which had long craved to forgive him, Lady Pointing Mallow, as a matter of fact, had done so, brightened wonderfully. And after considerable obscure activities, he declared himself a philanthropic liberal with open spaces in his platform, and in a position, and ready, as a beginning, to try the quality of the conservative South. He was away making certain decisive arrangements in Paris and elsewhere at the time of the landing of the Sea Lady. Before the matter was finally settled, it was necessary that something should be said to a certain great public character, and then he was to return and tell Adeline. And everyone was expecting him daily, including, it is now indisputable, the Sea Lady. 3. The meeting of Miss Glendower and her affianced lover on his return from Paris was one of those scenes in this story for which I have scarcely an inkling of the true details. He came to Folkestone and stopped at the Métropole, the Bunting house being full, and the Métropole being the nearest hotel to Sandgate. And he walked down in the afternoon and asked for Adeline, which was pretty rather than correct. I gather that they met in the drawing room, and as Chatteris closed the door behind him, I imagine there was something in the nature of a caress. I must confess I envy the freedom of a novelist who can take you behind such a locked door as this and give you all that such persons say and do, but with the strongest will in the world to blend the little scraps of fact I have into a continuous sequence of events, I falter at this occasion. After all, I never saw Adeline at all, until after all these things were over. And what is she now? A rather tall, a rather restless and active woman, very keen and obvious in public affairs, with something gone out of her. Melville once saw a gleam of that, but for the most part Melville never liked her. She had a wider grasp of things than he, and he was a little afraid of her. She was, in some inexplicable way, neither a pretty woman, nor a dear lady, nor a grande dame, nor totally insignificant, and a heretic, therefore, in Melville's scheme of things. He gives me small material for that earlier Adeline. She posed, he says. She was political, and she was always reading Mrs. Humphrey Ward. The last Melville regarded as the most heinous offense. It is not the least of my cousin's weaknesses that he regards this great novelist as an extremely corrupting influence for intelligent girls. She makes them good and serious in the wrong way, he says. Adeline, he asserts, was absolutely built on her. She was always attempting to be the incarnation of Marcella. It was he who had perverted Mrs. Bunting's mind to adopt this fancy. But I don't believe for a moment in this idea of girls building themselves on heroines in fiction. These are matters of elective affinity, and unless some bullying critic or preacher sends us astray, we take each to our own novelist, as the souls in the Swedenborgian system take to their hells. Adeline took to the imaginary Marcella. There was, Melville says, the strongest likeness in their mental atmosphere. They have the same defects, a bias for superiority, to use his expressive phrase, the same disposition towards arrogant benevolence, that same obtuseness to little shades of feeling that leads people to speak habitually of the lower classes and to think in the vein of that phrase. They certainly have the same virtues, conscious and conscientious integrity, hard nobility without one touch of magic, an industrious thoroughness. More than in anything else, Adeline delighted in her novelist's thoroughness, her freedom from impressionism, the patient resolution with which she went into the corners and swept under the mat of every incident. And it would be easy to argue from that Adeline behaved as Mrs. Ward's most characteristic heroine behaved on an analogous occasion. Marcella, we know, at least after her heart was changed, would have clung to him. There would have been a moment of high emotion in which thoughts of the highest class mingled with the natural ambition of two people in the prime of life and power. Then she would have receded with a quick movement and listened with her beautiful hand pensive against her cheek, while Chatteris began to sum up the forces against him, to speculate on the action of this group and that. Something infinitely tender and maternal would have spoken in her, pledging her to the utmost help that love and a woman can give. She would have produced in Chatteris that exquisite mingled impression of grace, passion, self-yielding, which, in all its infinite variations and repetitions, made up for him the constant poem of her beauty. But that is the dream and not the reality. So Adeline might have dreamt of behaving, but she was not Marcella, and only wanting to be. And he was not only not Maxwell, but he had no intention of being Maxwell anyhow. If he had had an opportunity of becoming Maxwell, he would probably have rejected it with extreme incivility. So they met like two unheroic human beings with shy and clumsy movements and, I suppose, fairly honest eyes. Something there was in the nature of a caress, I believe, and then I inclined to fancy she said, "Well," and I think he must have answered, "It's all right." After that, and rather allusively, with a backward jerk of the head at intervals, as it were towards the great personage, Chatteris must have told her particulars. He must have told her that he was going to contest Hythe, and that the little difficulty with the Glasgow Commission agent, who wanted to run the Radical ticket as a man of Kent, had been settled without injury to the party, such as it is. Assuredly, they talked politics, because soon after, when they came into the garden side by side to where Mrs. Bunting and the Sea Lady sat watching the girls play croquet, Adeline was in full possession of all these facts. I fancy that for such a couple as they were, such intimation of success, such earnest topics, replaced, to a certain extent at any rate, the vain repetition of vulgar endearments. The Sea Lady appears to have been the first to see them. "Here he is," she said abruptly. "Whom?" said Mrs. Bunting. glancing up at eyes that were suddenly eager, and then following their glance toward Chatteris. "Your other son," said the sea lady, jesting, unheeded. "It's Harry and Adeline," cried Mrs. Bunting. "Don't they make a handsome couple?" But the sea lady made no reply, and leaned back, scrutinizing their advance. Certainly they made a handsome pair, coming out of the veranda into the blaze of the sun and across the trim lawn towards the shadow of the ilex trees. They were lit, as it were, with a more glorious limelight, and displayed, like actors on a stage, more spacious than the stage of any theatre. The figure of Chatteris must have come out tall and fair and broad, a little sunburned, and I gather even then a little preoccupied, as indeed he always seemed to be in those latter days. And beside him, Adeline, glancing now up at him, and now towards the audience under the trees, dark and a little flushed, rather tall, though not so tall as Marcella seems to have been, and, without any instructions from any novel writer in the world, glad. Chatteris did not discover that there was anyone but Buntings under the tree until he was close at hand. Then the abrupt discovery of this stranger seems to have checked whatever he was prepared to say for his debut, and Adeline took the center of the stage. Mrs. Bunting was standing up, and all the croquet players, except Mabel, who was winning, converged on Chatteris with cries of welcome. Mabel remained in the midst of what I understand is called a tea party, loudly demanding that they should see her play it out. No doubt, if everything had gone well, she would have given a most edifying exhibition of what croquet can sometimes be. Adeline swam forward to Mrs. Bunting and cried, with a note of triumph in her voice, "It is all settled. Everything is settled. He is to contest Hyde." Quite involuntarily, her eyes must have met the sea lady's. It is, of course, quite impossible to say what she found there, or indeed what there was to find there then. For a moment they faced riddles, and then the sea lady turned her eyes, with a long-deferred scrutiny, to which she probably saw now closely for the first time. One wonders whether it is just possible that there may have been something, if it were no more than a gleam of surprise or inquiry, in that meeting of their eyes. Just for a moment she held his regard, and then it shifted inquiringly to Mrs. Bunting. That lady intervened effusively with it, "Oh, I forgot," and introduced them. I think they went through that without another meeting of the foils of their regard. "You back?" said Fred to Chatteris, touching his arm, and Chatteris confirmed this happy guess. The Bunting girls seemed to welcome Adeline's enviable situation rather than Chatteris as an individual, and Mabel's voice could be heard approaching. "Oughtn't they to see me play it out, Mr. Chatteris?" "Hello, my boy," cried Mr. Bunting, who was cultivating a bluff manner. "How's Paris?" "How's the fishing?" said Harry. And so they came into a vague circle about this lively person who had won them all, except Parker, of course, who remained in her own proper place, and was, I am certain, never to be won by anybody. There was a handing and shifting of garden chairs. No one seemed to take the slightest notice of Adeline's dramatic announcement. The Buntings were not good at thinking of things to say. She stood in the midst of the group like a leading lady when the other actors had forgotten their parts. And everyone woke up to this, as it were, and they went off in a volley. "So, it's really all settled," said Mrs. Bunting. And Betty Bunting said, "There is to be an election then." And Nettie said, "What fun." Mr. Bunting remarked with a knowing air, "So you saw him then?" And Fred flung "Hooray" into the tangle of sounds. The sea lady, of course, said nothing. "We'll give 'em a jolly good fight for it, anyhow," said Mr. Bunting. "Well, I hope we shall do that," said Chatteris. "We shall do more than that," said Adeline. "Oh, yes," said Betty Bunting, "we shall." "I knew they would let him," said Adeline. If they had any sense, said Mr. Bunting. Then came a pause, and Mr. Bunting was emboldened to lift up his voice and utter politics. They are getting sense, he said. They are learning that a party must have men of birth and training. Money and the mob, they've tried to keep things going by playing to fads and class jealousies. And the Irish. And they've had their lesson. How? Why, we've stood aside. We've left them to faddists and fomenters and the Irish. And here they are. It's a revolution in the party. We've let it down. Now we must pick it up again. He made a gesture with his fat little hand, one of those fat, pink little hands that appear to have neither flesh nor bones inside them, but only sawdust or horsehair. Mrs. Bunting leaned back in her chair and smiled at him indulgently. It is no common election, said Mr. Bunting. It is a great issue. The sea lady had been regarding him thoughtfully.
Okay,
What
guys, now you
is a
can
great
see.
issue?
I'm just going to
She asked.
get up from the
I don't
chair,
quite
pause
understand.
that there,
Mr. Bunting spread.
and tell you that, yeah, that's construction lines 101. Ugh, not finished. Stretching. No, not finished, but we'll do the rest of it in a moment. But as you see, what I've done there is just basically gone over everything that I drew on paper. I've tried to tweak some of it, but I kind of, whatever with it. I can add a load more shading, which will be the next video, guys. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel, and ding the bell unless the video is already out. So definitely check at the end of the video. There should be a link towards the playlist, at least, if not do the next part of this video, which will be shading, and then we'll be doing the colouring phase afterwards. I might do the colouring first, then do the colouring, and then do the shading. I'm not sure. Shading, it looks good before doing, and then adding on top. But we're going to be adding lighting, shading, and all sorts of different things. So I might do 2 videos on just light shading with colour in there with it. Colouring takes pretty much the same time as drawing it itself. That, I don't know what time we are looking at. Well, how long we've been streaming? Yeah, about an hour. So I'll get this next part done pretty quickly and wrap up this video. If you're watching live, guys, definitely still leave some comments. Or if you are watching back, you can still leave me a comment by scrolling all the way to the bottom. Let me know if you're enjoying this playlist, and if you want any more Liverbox recordings whilst I'm drawing in the background. Well, sorry, while I'm drawing, and that's in the background. We'll get some. If you've got any of your favourites and you want me to draw a picture of your favourite book, again, guys, let me know over on Instagram. I do not mind drawing anything. I like a challenge, so anything you can challenge me with is the most of better. Shall we continue?
Himself to explain to her. This, he said to begin with. Adeline listened with a mingling of interest and impatience, attempting ever and again to suppress him and to involve Chatteris by a tactful interposition. But Chatteris appeared disinclined to be involved. He seemed indeed quite interested in Mr. Bunting's views. Presently the croquet quartet went back, at Mabel's suggestion, to their game, and the others continued their political talk. It became more personal at last, dealing soon, quite specifically, with all that Chatteris was doing, and more particularly all that Chatteris was to do. Mrs. Bunting suddenly suppressed Mr. Bunting as he was offering advice, and Adeline took the burden of the talk again. She indicated vast purposes. This election is merely the opening of a door, she said. When Chatteris made modest disavowals, she smiled with a proud and happy consciousness of what she meant to make of him. And Mrs. Bunting supplied footnotes to make it all clear to the sea lady. He's so modest, she said at one point, and Chatteris pretended not to hear and went rather pink. Ever and again he attempted to deflect the talk towards the sea lady and away from himself, but he was hampered by his ignorance of her position. And the sea lady said scarcely anything, but watched Chatteris and Adeline, and more particularly Chatteris in relation to Adeline. End of chapter 5. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 6 of The Sea Lady. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Sea Lady by H.G. Wells. Chapter the 6th. Symptomatic. 1. My cousin Melville is never very clear about his dates. Now, this is greatly to be regretted, because it would be very illuminating indeed if one could tell just how many days elapsed before he came upon Chatteris in intimate conversation with the Sea Lady. He was going along the front of the Leas with some books from the public library that Miss Glendower had suddenly wished to consult, and which she, with that entire ignorance of his lack of admiration for her, which was part of her want of charm for him, had bidden him bring her. It was in one of those sheltered paths just under the brow, which give such a pleasant and characteristic charm to Folkestone, that he came upon a little group about the Sea Lady's bath chair. Chatteris was seated in one of the wooden seats that are embedded in the bank, and was leaning forward and looking into the Sea Lady's face. And she was speaking with a smile that struck Melville, even at the time, as being a little special in its quality, and she seems to have been capable of many charming smiles. Parker was a little distance away, where a sort of bastion projects and gives a wide view of the pier and harbor and the coast of France, regarding it all with a qualified disfavor. And the bath chairman was crumpled up against the bank, lost in that wistful melancholy that the constant perambulation of broken humanity necessarily engenders. My cousin slackened his pace a little and came up and joined them. The conversation hung at his approach. Chatteris sat back a little, but there seemed no resentment, and he sought a topic for the three to discuss in the books Melville carried. Books? He said. For Miss Glendower, said Melville. Oh, said Chatteris. What are they about? Asked the Sea Lady. Land tenure, said Melville. That's hardly my subject, said the Sea Lady, and Chatteris joined in her smile as if he saw a jest. There was a little pause. You are contesting Hythe, said Melville. Fate points that way, said Chatteris. They threaten a dissolution for September. It will come in a month, said Chatteris, with the inimitable tone of one who knows. In that case, we shall soon be busy. And I may canvass, said the Sea Lady. I never have. Miss Waters, explained Chatteris, has been telling me she means to help us. He met Melville's eye frankly. It's rough work, Miss Waters, said Melville. I don't mind that. It's fun, and I want to help. I really do want to help, Mr. Chatteris. You know, that's encouraging. I could go around with you in my bath chair. It would be a picnic, said Chatteris. I mean to help anyhow, said the Sea Lady. You know the case for the plaintiff? Asked Melville. She looked at him. You've got your arguments? I shall ask them to vote for Mr. Chatteris, and afterwards, when I see them, I shall remember them and smile and wave my hand. What else is there? Nothing, said Chatteris, and shut the lid on Melville. I wish I had an argument as good. What sort of people are they here? Asked Melville. Isn't there a smuggling interest to conciliate? I haven't asked that, said Chatteris. Smuggling is over and past, 40 years ago. It always has been 40 years ago. They trotted out the last of the smugglers, interesting old man full of reminiscences, when there was a Count of the Saxon shore. He remembered smuggling 40 years ago. Really, I doubt if there ever was any smuggling. The existing Coast Guard is a sacrifice to a vain superstition. Why, cried the Sea Lady, only about 5 weeks ago I saw quite near here. She stopped abruptly and caught Melville's eye. He grasped her difficulty. In a paper, he suggested. Yes, in a paper, she said, seizing the rope he threw her. Well, said Chatteris. There is smuggling still, said the Sea Lady, with an air of someone who decides not to tell an anecdote that is suddenly found to be half forgotten. There's no doubt it happens, said Chatteris, missing it all, but it doesn't appear in the electioneering. I certainly shan't agitate for a faster revenue cutter. However things may be in that respect, I take the line that they are very well as they are. That's my line, of course. And he looked out to sea. The eyes of Melville and the Sea Lady had an intimate moment. There, you know, is just a specimen of the sort of thing we do, said Chatteris. Are you prepared to be as intricate as that? Quite, said the Sea Lady. My cousin was reminded of an anecdote. The talk degenerated into anecdotes of canvassing and ran shallow. My cousin was just gathering that Mrs. Bunting and Miss Bunting had been with the Sea Lady and had gone into the town to a shop when they returned. Chatteris rose to greet them and explained, what had been by no means apparent before, that he was on his way to Adeline, and after a few further trivialities, he and Melville went on together. A brief silence fell between them. Who is that, Miss Waters? Said Chatteris. Friend of Mrs. Bunting, prevaricated Melville. So I gather. She seems a very charming person. She is. She's interesting. Her illness seems to throw her up. It makes a passive thing of her, like a picture or something that's imaginary. Imagined, anyhow. She sits there and smiles and responds. Her eyes have something intimate, and yet my cousin offered no assistance. Where did Mrs. Bunting find her? My cousin had to gather himself together for a second or so. There's something, he said deliberately, that Mrs. Bunting doesn't seem to suppose. What can it be? Oh, it's bound to be all right, said Melville, rather weakly. It's strange, too. Mrs. Bunting is usually so disposed. Melville left that to itself. That's what one feels, said Chatteris. What? Mystery. My cousin shares with me a profound detestation of that high mystic method of treating women. He likes women to be finite and nice. In fact, he likes everything to be finite and nice. So he merely grunted. But Chatteris was not to be stopped by that. He passed to a critical note. No doubt it's all illusion. All women are impressionists. A patch, a light. You get an effect. And that is all you are meant to get, I suppose. She gets an effect. But how? That's the mystery. It's not merely beauty. There's plenty of beauty in the world, but not of these effects. The eyes, I fancy. He dwelt on that for a moment. There's really nothing in eyes, you know, Chatteris, said my cousin Melville, borrowing an alien argument and a tone of analytical cynicism from me. Have you ever looked at eyes through a hole in the sheet? Oh, I don't know, said Chatteris. I don't mean the mere physical eye. Perhaps it's the look of health and the bath chair. A bold discord. You don't know what's the matter, Melville? How? I gather from Bunt.
Oh, no! It's my battery. Give me a second. This should work. Oh, of course, now it's turned itself off. Oh no! I have to fix everything because I'm live. Broken. Hopefully the camera ain't bloody moved now. What the hell's this bolt from? Fuse box. Fuses. Light fuses go in there. Right. Hopefully it should work now. Oops. Oh, we're doing so well. Nearly finished. Nearly done all the construction lines. I like to do a stage each day, guys. As you all know. I'm gonna sneeze. Oh. Oh, excuse me. Right. Flick back and get that back on. Again, I'm working with one screen. Normally I'd have two. There we go.
Oh,
Back on.
I gather
what
from
we're watching,
Bunting it's
listening to, guys.
disablement, not
There you go.
deformity. He ought to know. I'm not so sure of that. You don't happen to know the nature of her disablement. I can't tell at all, said Melville in a speculative tone. It struck him he was getting to prevaricate better. The subject seemed exhausted. They spoke of a common friend whom the sight of the metropole suggested. Then they did not talk at all for a time, until the stir and interest of the bandstand was past. Then Chatteris threw out a thought. Complex business, feminine motives, he remarked. How? This canvassing. She can't be interested in philanthropic liberalism. There's a difference in the type. And besides, it's a personal matter. Not necessarily, is it? Surely there's not such an intellectual gap between the sexes. If you can get interested, oh, I know. Besides, it's not a question of principles. It's the fun of electioneering. Fun? There's no knowing what won't interest the feminine mind, said Melville, and added, or what will? Chatteris did not answer. It's the direct visiting instinct, I suppose, said Melville. They all have it. It's the canvassing. All women like to go into houses that don't belong to them. Very likely, said Chatteris shortly, and failing a reply from Melville, he gave way to secret meditations, it would seem still of a fairly agreeable sort. The 12 o'clock gun thudded from Shorncliffe camp. By Jove, said Chatteris, and quickened his steps. They found Adeline busy amidst her papers. As they entered, she pointed reproachfully, yet with the protrusion of a certain Marcella-like undertone of sweetness, at the clock. The apologies of Chatteris were effusive and winning, and involved no mention of the sea lady on the leaves. Melville delivered his books and left them, already wading deeply into the details of the district organization that the local Liberal organizer had submitted. 2. A little while after the return of Chatteris, my cousin Melville and the sea lady were under the ilex at the end of the sea garden, and, disregarding Parker, as everyone was accustomed to do, who was in a garden chair doing some afternoon work at a proper distance, there was nobody with them at all. Fred and the girls were out cycling. Fred had gone with them at the sea lady's request, and Miss Glendower and Mrs. Bunting were at Hythe, calling diplomatically on some rather horrid local people who might be serviceable to Harry in his electioneering. Mr. Bunting was out fishing. He was not fond of fishing, but he was, in many respects, an exceptionally resolute little man, and he had taken to fishing every day in the afternoon after luncheon in order to break himself of what Mrs. Bunting called his ridiculous habit of getting seasick whenever he went out in a boat. He said that if fishing from a boat with pieces of mussels for bait after luncheon would not break the habit, nothing would. And certainly it seemed at times as if it were going to break everything that was in him. But the habit came. This, however, is a digression. These two, I say, were sitting in the ample shade under the evergreen oak, and Melville, I imagine, was in those fine, faintly patterned flannels that in the year 1899 combined correctness with ease. He was no doubt looking at the shaded face of the sea lady, framed in a frame of sunlit yellow-green lawn and black-green ilex leaves, at least so my impulse for verisimilitude conceives it, and she at first was pensive and downcast that afternoon, and afterwards she was interested, and looked into his eyes. Either she must have suggested that he might smoke, or else he asked. Anyhow, his cigarettes were produced. She looked at them with an arrested gesture, and he hung for a moment, doubtful on her gesture. I supposed you, he said. I never learned. He glanced at Parker and then met the sea lady's regard. "It's one of the things I came for," she said. He took the only course. She accepted a cigarette and examined it thoughtfully. "Down there," she said, "it's just one of the things. You will understand we get nothing but saturated tobacco. Some of the mermen, there's something they have picked up from the sailors. Quids, I think they call it, but that's too horrid for words." She dismissed the unpleasant topic by a movement and lapsed into thought. My cousin clicked his matchbox. She had a momentary doubt and glanced towards the house. "Mrs. Bunting?" she asked. Several times, I understand, she asked the same thing. "She wouldn't mind," said Melville, and stopped. "She won't think it improper," he amplified, "if nobody else thinks it improper." "There's nobody else," said the sea lady, glancing at Parker, and my cousin lit the match. My cousin has an indirect habit of mind. With all general and all personal things, his desperation to get at them obliquely amounts almost to a passion. He could no more go straight to a crisis than a cat could to a stranger. He came off at a tangent now as he was sitting forward and scrutinizing her first very creditable efforts to draw. "I just wonder," he said, "exactly what it was you did come for." She smiled at him over a little jet of smoke. "Why, this," she said. "And hairdressing." "And dressing." She smiled again after a momentary hesitation. "And all this sort of thing," she said, as if she felt she had answered him perhaps a little below his deserts. Her gesture indicated the house and the lawn, and my cousin Melville wondered just exactly how much else. "Am I doing it right?" asked the sea lady. "Beautifully," said my cousin, with a faint sigh in his voice. "What do you think of it?" "It was worth coming
My
for,"
son's
said
coming
the sea
home, my
lady,
dog's going
smiling into
mental.
his eyes.
Alright, so let's get this done
"But
quick.
did you really just come?" She filled in his
Hello! How
"To
are
see
you?
what life was like on land here? Isn't that enough?"
I knew you were coming, the dog wouldn't.
Melville's cigarette had failed to light. He regarded its blighted career pensively. "Life," he said, "isn't all this sort of thing. This sort of thing? Sunlight, cigarette smoking, talk, looking nice. But it's made up, not altogether. For example, oh, you
How are
know."
you?
"What?"
You right?
"You know," said
Nice day at
Melville, and would not look
Nice
at
day at
her.
school?
"I decline to know,"
I'll talk to you in a
she
minute.
said after a little pause.
About
"Besides,"
what you asked me
he said, "yes, you told Mrs. Bunting." It occurred to him that he was
Well,
telling
why?
tales,
I don't
but
really
that
know how
scruple
to
came
podcast
too
it.
late. "Well,
I'll talk to you in a minute.
something
Get
about
yourself
a
sorted,
soul."
right, you're back.
She made no immediate answer. He looked up, and her eyes were smiling. "Mr. Melville," she said innocently, "what is a soul?" "Well," said my cousin readily, and then paused for a space. "A soul," said he, and knocked an imaginary ash from his extinct cigarette. "A soul," he repeated, and glanced at Parker. "A soul, you know," he said again, and looked at the sea lady with the air of a man who is handling a difficult matter with skillful care. "Come to think of it," he said, "it's a rather complicated matter to explain." "To a being without one?" "To anyone," said my cousin Melville, suddenly admitting his difficulty. He meditated upon her eyes for a moment. "Besides," he said, "you know what a soul is perfectly well." "No," she answered, "I don't." "You know as well as I do." "Ah, that may be different. You came to get a soul." "Perhaps I don't want one." "Why, if one hasn't one—" "Ah, there," and my cousin shrugged his shoulders. "But really, you know, it's just the generality of it that makes it hard to define. Everybody has a soul. Everyone, except me. I'm not certain of that. Mrs. Bunting, certainly. And Mr. Bunting, everyone has. Miss Glendower, lots. The sea lady mused. She went off at a tangent abruptly. Mr. Melville, she said, what is a union of souls? Melville flicked his extinct cigarette suddenly into an elbow shape and then threw it away. The phrase may have awakened some reminiscence. It's an extra, he said. It's a sort of flourish, and sometimes it's like leaving cards by footmen, a substitute for the real presence. There came a gap. He remained downcast, trying to find a way towards whatever it was that was in his mind to say. Conceivably, he did not clearly know what that might be until he came to it. The sea lady abandoned an attempt to understand him in favor of a more urgent topic. Do you think Miss Glendower and Mr. Chatteris? Melville looked up at her. He noticed she had hung on the latter name. Decidedly, he said, it's just what they would do. Then he spoke again. Chatteris, he said. Yes, said she. I thought so, said Melville. The sea lady regarded him gravely. They scrutinized each other with an unprecedented intimacy. Melville was suddenly direct. It was a discovery that it seemed he ought to have made all along. He felt quite unaccountably bitter. He spoke with a twitch of the mouth, and his voice had a note of accusation. You want to talk about him? She nodded, still grave. Well, I don't. He changed his note. But I will, if you wish it. I thought you could. Oh, you know, said Melville, discovering his extinct cigarette was within reach of a vindictive heel.
Right,
She said,
here goes all the dots.
well, said Melville. I saw him first, she apologized, some years ago. Where? In the South Seas, near Tonga. And that is really what you came for? This time her manner was convincing. She admitted, yes. Melville was carefully impartial. He's slightly, he admitted, and well built and a decent chap, but I don't see why you. He went off at a tangent. He didn't see you. Oh, no. Melville's pose and tone suggested a mind of extreme liberality. I don't see why you came, he said, nor what you mean to do. You see, with an air of noting a trifling but valid obstacle, there's Miss Glendower. Is there? She said. Well, isn't there? That's just it, she said. And besides, after all, you know, why should you? I admit it's unreasonable, she said, but why reason about it? It's a matter of the imagination. For him? How should I know how it takes him? That is what I want to know. Melville looked her in the eyes again. You know, you're not playing fair, he said. To her, to anyone. Why? Because you are immortal and unencumbered. Because you can do everything you want to do, and we cannot. I don't know why we cannot, but we cannot. Here we are with our short lives and our little souls to save or lose, fussing for our little concerns, and you, out of the elements, come and beckon. The elements have their rights, she said, and then the elements are the elements, you know. That is what you forget. Imagination? Certainly. That's the element. Those elements of your chemists, yes, are all imagination. There isn't any other. She went on. And all the elements of your life, the life you imagine you are living, the little things you must do, the little cares, the extraordinary little duties, the day by day, the hypnotic limitations, all these things are a fancy that has taken hold of you too strongly for you to shake off. You daren't, you mustn't, you can't. To us who watch you, you watch us?
Never mind.
Oh, yes. We watch you, and sometimes we envy you.
That's, yeah.
Not only for the dry air and the sunlight and the shadows of trees,
Okay,
and
right.
the feeling of morning
that
the
brings
pleasantness
this
of many such things.
video.
But because your lives
To a
begin and
finish.
end,
Let's get
because
playlist
you look towards
paused and just give you a quick how to, what to. I just completed. Ooh, right, so like I said, we went from layer 1, we turned down the opacity, and we're going to turn back up the opacity, turn off these 2 lines here, so we've already done. We've just finished this. We're going to shade it tomorrow, guys, so tune in for that one. I might just do colouring tomorrow, I don't know. Let me know in the video what you want me to do. Either one will be linked at the end of the video if you're watching back. Yeah, keep watching for that one. Or go and check out the pencil version if you want to go see how I did it, or drew it out. And what again, we use the words octopus, ice, dawn, Disney, future, dark, and treasure. They are all in the picture. Definitely let me know if you think I've missed something, but tomorrow will be the color, and today all the construction lines are complete. Get rid of that. Don't need that layer on anymore. We've got all the construction lines complete. Tomorrow we'll be putting on the shading and other things that need to be there. Check over on Instagram, guys, if you want to see this picture in a better quality. Towards the end of the week, I will release it. But the last video probably will be over the weekend, so don't forget to hit subscribe and ding the bell for notifications. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.
Oh, that's weird.